This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and today I'll tell you a story that will make your heart ache and your soul burn for justice. It starts with the fence, a plain cedar thing with a soft honey glow and the faint scent of resin in the heat of late summer. The kind of fence that keeps out dogs and drifting trash, but not the whispers of a nosy neighbor with a manicure that clicks like castanets against her phone screen. She introduced herself the day I moved in, squinting at the moving van as if it were a delivery of bad decisions. "I'm Karen," she said, drawing the name out like a chant. "Block captain. HOA rules are important around here." She didn't smile. She assessed like I was an invoice overdue. I'd come to the neighborhood to rebuild, to find a quiet patch of ordinary after losing everything that wasn't nailed down in a divorce and a job layoff that arrived in the same week, like twin storms colliding over one unlucky house. I found solace in small projects, scrubbing the porch, replacing a cracked mailbox, painting the door a hopeful slate blue. The fence came last on a Saturday that smelled like cut grass and second chances. The contractor finished just before dusk, and under the amber street lamps the boards looked like a choir of new beginnings. I admired them with the reverence you give to something you built after all the building inside you fell apart. That's when Karen strolled over, wearing a visor, clutching a clipboard, her lips puckered as if tasting a lemon that never quite got ripe. "That fence is a choice," she said, voice flat as a cul-de-sac cold of charm. She made a note. She always made notes. "It doesn't conform to the neighborhood's cohesive aesthetic." She made air quotes with nails that could open a bank vault. I showed her the permit. I showed her the material sample and the HOA guidebook I'd downloaded, highlighted, and practically eaten. She sniffed. "We'll see," she said, and tilted her head in that way people do when they aren't listening but want to look like they just judged you fairly. 2 days later, I got the email. An official complaint filed with the HOA, citing an ugly fence in violation of color harmony provisions. The subject line might as well have been a hiss. The fine would be assessed weekly until I corrected it. I stared at the screen, that cold white rectangle, and something inside me, a small, stubborn candle, flared. Because I had read the bylaws, I knew the measurements down to the half-inch. I had cross-referenced paint codes and lot lines, slope allowances, and sightline setbacks. I had followed the rules, even when no one else did, even when the neighbor across the street had 5 different garden gnomes mooning the sidewalk in 4 shades of beige. But here's what Karen didn't know. The HOA was holding elections. The board had been a skeleton crew, folded into itself like an origami swan too tired to float. There was a whisper campaign for new blood, for someone who wouldn't weaponize the word aesthetic against freshly broken people trying to put their lives back together. I wasn't interested in power. I was interested in fairness, in kindness, in the kind of governance that remembers its neighbors, not subjects, who must live with decisions. Still, I filled out the form, my hands shaking with a cocktail of rage and resolve, because sometimes the only way to survive a bully is to stand tall enough to cast a longer shadow. I attended the meetings. I kept my camera off, my name a blank square among blanker faces, listening to the brittle timbre of a community fraying. People were tired of the fines for flower pots, the letters for lawn heights, the humiliation of getting photographed by someone who thought authority was a yardstick to smack knuckles. At the ballot deadline, I submitted mine with a quiet prayer and a louder promise. If I got in, I would remember the fence that wasn't actually about wood, but about the right to rebuild without apology. The results came on a Tuesday night while cicadas revved their engines in the trees. I was the new HOA president, by a margin so wide it felt like a bridge out of old habits. For a moment, I just sat there with my hands pressed together, listening to the drumbeat in my chest. Victory didn't taste like champagne. It tasted like tap water after a long run. Plain, necessary, almost holy. I emailed the board to schedule our first meeting. Karen replied instantly, her words bright with brittle control. "Congratulations. I trust you'll abide by established procedures. For instance, your fence." I let the silence digest her tone before I answered. "Of course. Procedures will be followed. All of them." And then I started the work of turning memory into strategy. I printed every bylaw. I mapped every violation complaint for the last 2 years on a spreadsheet that looked like confetti and sorrow. The pattern was unmistakable. A cluster around Karen's block, a steady drip of fines that felt less like stewardship and more like sport. I talked to neighbors on sunset walks, people who whispered like kids under blankets. She's taken photos of our kids' bikes. She's measured our porch lights. She's left notes about wind chimes. They were embarrassed by their own fear, and that's the worst part, when shame sneaks in wearing your enemy's perfume. I didn't promise a reckoning. I promised a review. But inside me, the word revenge simmered. Not as a scream, but as a careful simmer. A stew you don't burn because you plan to serve it with ceremony. I kept my face neutral as a slate blue door while I assembled the agenda, stacking documents neatly. Evidence, testimony, the neat lines of policy that can be mercy or a blade, depending on who holds them. And in those nights, with boxes still half unpacked and the fence mellowing into its own golden quiet, I remembered everything I'd lost. The marriage that fell through my fingers like dry sand. The job that let me go with a "we value you" email template. The version of myself that believed in second chances without having to fight for them. I realized I hadn't just built a fence. I'd built a boundary inside myself, the kind that says, enough. Enough of being easy to step over. Enough of apologizing for taking up space on a street where the sun is free and the mailbox is mine. So, when the day of the first meeting arrived, I dressed not in armor, but in calm, and carried the paper stack like an offering. Karen arrived early, of course, clipboard in hand, smile like a drawn bow. She took a seat right up front, crossing her legs as if the meeting were a runway, and she was about to strut down it wearing the season's hottest grievance. I opened the session, my voice steady. "We'll begin," I said, "with a review of enforcement patterns and due process." Karen's smile flickered. The neighbors leaned in, the room a held breath. I clicked to the first chart, and the story of us spilled onto the screen. Fines clustered like storm cells, names repeated until they looked like incantations. The room rustled, and suddenly it wasn't just about my fence. It was about dignity, about the fragile miracle of people trying to live peacefully in houses that echo with their private wars. And as the murmurs rose like wind through pine needles, I understood the task ahead, not to swing a hammer, but to build something worth fencing in. Karen's eyes glittered like glass marbles, her smile twitching at the corners as if straining under its own weight. She raised her hand halfway through my presentation, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a whistle. "Excuse me, Madam President," she said, the title dripping from her tongue as though coated in poison. "Are we here to discuss fences, or your personal vendetta against people who actually care about this neighborhood?" The room froze. Even the air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. I met her stare and said evenly, "We're here to discuss fairness. But if the shoe fits, Karen, maybe ask yourself why it's pinching." A few neighbors chuckled, quietly, nervously, but that sound was enough to crack the tension. Her face hardened, but her composure was slipping. She was no longer the queen of compliance she fancied herself to be. I turned the page of my notes and began reading aloud every instance of her name on complaint forms. 17? All filed anonymously, but traced through timestamps and metadata that matched her phone and laptop submissions. The audience murmured, growing louder as realization spread through the crowd. I could feel the shift. The power she'd hoarded in silence was now evaporating under light. Karen tried to interrupt, claiming coincidence, claiming community spirit, claiming everything except responsibility. But the truth has a strange gravity. Once it starts falling, no one can stop it. And fall it did. The treasurer, a quiet man with wire-framed glasses, cleared his throat and asked to motion for an internal review of all penalties issued under Karen's tenure. The motion passed unanimously. Even those who had once nodded along to her every dictate now avoided her gaze. She sat there trembling, not in fear but in fury, the kind that comes when control begins to slip like sand through clenched fists. That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind in the empty hall, stacking papers, my heart heavy with victory's hollow echo. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was something darker, older. The part of me that remembered standing in a courtroom as my ex-husband twisted his betrayal into self-defense, as my former boss smiled apologetically while handing me a severance envelope. The part that learned you can follow every rule and still get punished by people who write their own. I wanted justice, not vengeance, but maybe they were siblings wearing different masks. Over the next few weeks, Karen's empire of petty tyranny began to crumble. Neighbors she once cowed now ignored her. Her complaint emails bounced back unanswered. I reinstated fines she'd issued unfairly, refunded those she'd targeted, and replaced her self-appointed Decor Standards Committee with an open vote system. The neighborhood began to breathe again. You could feel it. Porches repainted in new colors, wind chimes tinkling without fear of citation, laughter drifting across yards like something long exiled coming home. But power once lost doesn't vanish quietly. It lingers, like a storm waiting for a spark. I came home one evening to find deep scratches across my fence, crude and angry, as if carved by someone desperate to erase what they couldn't control. The wood splintered where the blade dug too deep, raw and pale beneath the stain. My stomach turned. No one else would have done that. The next morning, Karen pretended not to see me when she drove by, but her jaw was clenched tight, her eyes darting toward the fence. I didn't call the police. I didn't confront her. I documented everything, photos, timestamps, notes, and filed it quietly the way she used to. Because revenge isn't loud. It's patient. It waits in the paperwork, in the silence, in the moment someone believes they got away with it. A week later, an HOA inspection revealed that Karen's backyard shed, the pride of her perfectly controlled world, violated 3 property codes, one for unapproved modifications, one for boundary encroachment, and one for improper drainage, all discovered by a random rotation audit I had instituted for fairness. She'd have to dismantle it or face daily fines. Her reaction was nuclear. She stormed into the meeting, her cheeks flushed crimson, voice trembling with outrage. "This is harassment," she shrieked, slamming her clipboard on the table. "You're doing this to humiliate me!" I looked her dead in the eye and said softly, "No, Karen. I'm doing this to apply the same rules you loved so much." The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. She sputtered something about appeal, about bias, about injustice, but every word bounced off the walls and fell flat. The same walls she had once stood against neighbors with, now turned against her. The vote to uphold the violation was unanimous. She left in silence, her heels clicking like a metronome counting down her pride's final seconds. That night, I stood by my window, looking at my fence under the porch light. The scratches still showed, thin scars across its surface. I could have fixed them. I didn't. I wanted to remember. Because this wasn't just about Karen. It was about everyone who's ever been silenced, shamed, or punished for daring to live differently. And yet, even as I felt that grim satisfaction bloom in my chest, another feeling crept in. Exhaustion. I didn't want to be like her. I didn't want to live in a world where victory meant someone else's ruin. I thought about writing her a letter. Not an apology, but a truth. Something that said, "You could have been kind. You could have been better. So could I." But the words never made it to paper. Instead, I began focusing on rebuilding what mattered. The community. The small acts of care that turn neighbors into allies. Still, late at night, I'd hear her yard lights click on, that faint metallic hum of paranoia, and I'd know she was watching, waiting, plotting some new form of payback. What she didn't know was that her actions were already under review by county inspectors. A neighbor, anonymous, meticulous, had reported her shed drainage into public property. I didn't have to lift a finger. Sometimes revenge doesn't come from your hand. It comes from balance finding its own way home. But deep down, I sensed it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind of person who surrendered. She was the kind who'd rather burn the house down than admit she'd lost control of the match. And as autumn bled into winter, I could feel it, the tension tightening again, invisible but electric, coiling around every picket of my fence like a snake waiting to strike. The first snow of December fell like powdered sugar over the rooftops, softening the edges of everything, even the ugly history between me and Karen. For a brief moment, the neighborhood looked peaceful. The fences uniform under white blankets, the lawns sparkling with a truce no one signed but everyone silently accepted. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, breath steaming in the air, watching the world exhale. I thought maybe, just maybe, the storm had passed. But peace, I was learning, was fragile. It shattered under the smallest sound. That sound came one morning in the form of heavy fists pounding on my door. It was Karen, red-faced, clutching a citation notice from the city. "Did you do this?" she hissed, shoving the paper toward me. Her voice shook, a strange mix of fury and desperation. The notice accused her of improper water runoff damaging public property, exactly what I'd been warned about by the inspectors. I blinked at her, keeping my expression neutral. "Karen," I said softly, "I don't make city decisions. Maybe talk to them directly." She glared, searching my face for a flicker of guilt, something to confirm the villain she wanted me to be. "You think you've won, don't you?" she spat. "You think sitting in that little chair at the HOA makes you powerful? You're just another petty dictator in a smaller kingdom." Her words were venom, but behind them I saw something unexpected: fear. The kind of fear that comes when the walls you built to protect yourself start closing in. I could have told her the truth, that I didn't make that call, that the world was simply catching up to her misdeeds. But I stayed silent. Maybe that was cruel, maybe it was fair. She stormed off, her boots crunching in the snow like bones underfoot. For the next few days, I noticed her lights burning late into the night. Sometimes I'd catch a shadow pacing behind her curtains, frantic, restless. She'd been stripped of her control, and it was unraveling her. I should have felt pity, but all I felt was the cold. When the city crew came to inspect her property, they found not just the drainage violation, but an unauthorized gas line extension connected to her grill area. An expensive fix, a dangerous one. Rumor spread fast. Within a week, Karen's pristine reputation had turned to ash. Neighbors who once endured her scrutiny now whispered her name like a curse. I didn't feed the gossip. I didn't need to. The truth was louder than any story I could tell. Still, there was no joy in watching her crumble. Every night I lay awake wondering if this was justice or just another cycle of cruelty. One evening, as I walked to the mailbox, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a single photograph of my fence taken at night. Written across the back in angry red ink were 4 words: "You'll regret everything." My pulse spiked, cold fingers crawling up my spine. I looked around, the shadows suddenly thicker, the quiet too heavy. I checked my security camera footage later, but the motion sensors had failed that night. Either bad luck, or someone who knew how to avoid being seen. The next morning I filed a police report. They took notes, nodded politely, and promised to keep an eye out. It felt hollow. Fear has a way of stretching minutes into hours. Every creak became footsteps, every breeze a whisper. I started double-locking the doors, sleeping with my phone under the pillow. But still I dreamed of splintered wood and firelight. A week later, those dreams clawed into reality. I woke at 2:37 a.m. to a strange crackling sound. At first I thought it was ice breaking under the weight of snow. But then came the smell, thick and acrid, unmistakable. Smoke. My fence was burning. The flames licked up the boards like 1,000 small tongues, orange light dancing against the winter sky. I ran outside in my slippers, heart slamming, grabbing the garden hose that sputtered uselessly against the blaze. Neighbors poured out, shouting. Someone called the fire department. By the time they arrived, half the fence was gone, charred black and crumbling. The fire chief's flashlight swept across the ground. "Accelerant," he said grimly. "Someone set this." My mind screamed one name, but I couldn't say it. There was no proof, just instinct. And instinct doesn't hold up in court. Still, the look in her eyes when she watched from her window, arms folded, face ghostly pale in the glow of the sirens, told me everything I needed to know. She didn't come over. She didn't even pretend concern. Just stared, like an artist watching her masterpiece burn. The investigation dragged for weeks, then quietly died out with the last embers. No suspects, no evidence. Insurance covered part of the damage, but money couldn't rebuild what the fire had taken. Peace, safety, sleep. Yet even in the ashes, something shifted inside me. Fear turned into resolve, and resolve into strategy. If she wanted a war, she was about to learn what it felt like to lose one. I began collecting data. Every violation she'd ignored, every tax discrepancy, every recorded HOA complaint she'd dismissed as irrelevant. I documented everything, clean and quiet. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability wrapped in iron patience. When the next HOA audit rolled around, I submitted the full report anonymously to the county's Property Ethics Board. And when they opened a formal investigation into misuse of HOA funds, linked directly to Karen's unauthorized reimbursements, she finally realized she wasn't fighting a neighbor anymore. She was fighting consequences. By the time the board meeting came, she looked nothing like the woman who once strutted around with her clipboard and artificial smile. Her makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion. Her hands trembled when she spoke. "This is absurd," she muttered as they read the findings. "I didn't do anything wrong." But the numbers don't lie. The receipts were there. Her signature, her timestamps, her false justifications for expenses that never existed. The board voted unanimously for her removal and referred the matter to local authorities. It was done. Karen was finished. As I watched her gather her papers, shoulders bowed, something unexpected bloomed in my chest. Not triumph, but release. For the first time in months, I felt free. But even then, part of me wondered if justice ever comes clean, or if it always leaves a stain where mercy should have been. Winter melted into the bruised light of early spring, and the snow that once covered everything in silence gave way to the soft hum of renewal, the sound of lawnmowers, kids laughing, and fences being rebuilt. My new fence stood stronger this time, dark walnut with iron posts sunk deep into the soil, the kind of structure meant to outlast storms and grudges alike. The first time I ran my fingers along the smooth grain, I thought about everything that fence had seen, the battles, the fire, the betrayal that turned into purpose. It wasn't just wood, it was a monument. But revenge, no matter how justified, leaves ghosts behind, and Karen's shadow lingered long after she was gone. She sold her house quietly, no goodbye, no final tantrum, just one moving truck on a gray morning, her visor gone, her clipboard nowhere in sight. For days after, I caught myself glancing toward her empty porch, half expecting her to appear and correct me about the height of my garden bed. But she didn't. The silence she left behind was heavy and strange, like a wound that had finally stopped bleeding but still ached when the weather changed. At first, I felt nothing but relief. The neighborhood blossomed in her absence. Neighbors started gathering again, barbecues, garage sales, laughter drifting through the air like something sacred rediscovered. The atmosphere shifted from wary to warm, like we had all collectively exhaled. I should have been happy. But late at night, when the street was quiet, I'd find myself replaying everything, the flame-lit nights and cold mornings filled with paperwork and whispered rumors, and I wondered, had I become what I fought against? Power had a taste, subtle at first, then addictive. The more I tried to use it for good, the more I caught glimpses of my reflection in Karen's old habits. The way my tone sharpened during meetings, the way I cut off people mid-sentence if I thought they were wrong. It wasn't intentional. It was something creeping, invisible, growing inside the cracks revenge had left. One evening, after a particularly tense HOA meeting where I'd dismissed a young mother's complaint about playground repairs, I caught my own voice echoing, cold, clipped, authoritative. And for a moment, it wasn't me I heard. It was her. I went home, stood in front of the mirror, and whispered, "You can't become her." But the mirror didn't answer. It just reflected the quiet truth that every war changes its soldiers. A few days later, a letter arrived addressed to me, handwritten in looping script. No return address, just my name in delicate ink. I unfolded it carefully, heart hammering. Amelia, it began. You don't know me, but I was Karen's sister. She asked me to send this to you before she left. My fingers froze. The letter continued. She told me what happened between you two. She said you destroyed her life. She said she deserved it. But she also said something else, that for the first time in years she realized how it felt to be powerless, how she made others feel. You showed her that, and she said if she ever had the courage to apologize, she hoped you'd understand it wasn't about the fence. It was about fear. She spent her whole life building fences she thought would keep the world from hurting her, and in doing so, she became the thing she feared most. Alone. I sank into the couch, the words blurring as tears pooled in my eyes. She wanted me to tell you she's starting over, the letter ended. Somewhere quiet. She hopes you will too. I read it 3 times before setting it down. My chest felt like a battlefield between anger and forgiveness, between justice and compassion. She wasn't asking for reconciliation. She was handing me the final brick of her wall, asking me to decide what to do with it. That night, I walked outside and stood by my fence, the moonlight tracing silver lines across the boards. For the first time, I didn't see a barrier. I saw a boundary, one I could protect without weaponizing. I whispered to the air, not expecting an answer. We're both free now. And somehow, that felt true. In the months that followed, the HOA flourished. I made changes, real ones. We replaced fines with warnings, citations with conversations. People stopped being afraid of letters in their mailboxes. I watched gardens bloom wild and fences painted in every color of forgiveness. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was alive. One summer evening, a new family moved into Karen's old house, a young couple with 2 kids and a golden retriever that barked at butterflies. They waved from their yard, and I waved back. The irony didn't escape me. Life had replaced judgment with joy, and no one even remembered the wars fought on this street. But sometimes, when I walked past the corner where Karen used to stand, with her clipboard, I could almost hear her voice, soft now, not sharp. Maybe a memory, maybe a ghost, maybe just the echo of my own guilt. Keep it fair, it seemed to whisper. Don't forget how it feels. And I haven't. I still get complaints sometimes, minor ones about weeds or lights, but I read each one with care, remembering the way pain can hide behind perfection. The fence still stands, stronger than before, but I've planted wildflowers along its base, bright, untamed things that spill through the gaps and soften the lines. Neighbors say it's beautiful. Some call it messy. I just smile. It's both. It's real. It's human. And maybe that's what this story has always been about. Not revenge, not power, but the messy miracle of being seen, hurt, and still choosing to rebuild. This is Amelia from Amelia Voice. And if you've ever been broken by someone who mistook cruelty for control, I want you to know, healing isn't clean. It burns. It scars. But it also grows, stubborn as flowers through fence cracks. And sometimes that's the most beautiful revenge of all.